Okay. Here are the topics for tonight. I'll answer the questions: why cathedrals, and why Chartres Cathedral? Why are they so important to me, and why am I doing all of this? And then substantively, the big topic here tonight is going to be the liberal arts knowledge and wisdom. The liberal arts are prominent at Chartres Cathedral, particularly on what's called the Royal Portal of the West facade. And we'll be taking a good hard look at some of the evidence of their interest in the liberal arts there. And in the process, I'm going to set the stage and offer some context about transmitting knowledge from ancient Rome and before them, ancient Greece and others, into the Middle Ages. And how did that happen, and why is it important? Because it spurred what some people are now calling the medieval Renaissance in the 1100s and 1200s. So the Royal Portal sculpture is going to be one of the things we focus on here. And though that topic, the liberal arts, is going to take up most of the time tonight as we talk about a lot of the people who were involved with this transmission of knowledge. And then the last part of this is going to be about interpreting scripture and how the medieval theologians, the Christian theologians, went about it. We're going to be looking at one window at Chartres Cathedral that really exemplifies how they approached interpretation. And we'll talk a little bit about topics called types and concordance between the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and the New Testament in the Christian era. All right, let's see if there's anything else I need to say here. Okay. So why cathedrals? Why are they of interest to me? Two friends have asked me this in the last month or so. My good friend in St. Paul, Bob Wagner, and Winnie Moranville and Dave Wolf in Des Moines. And, I struggled a little bit to answer this when we talked, but I'm going to try to put a little bit of it out there and give everybody some context, especially those of you who are new to these series of talks. Some of you heard this, a little bit of it, in the first time around, but I want to offer a little more information on this or some thinking about it. I took a class at St. Louis University on art and architecture, taught by Father Maurice B. McNamee from Montello, Wisconsin, originally, a delightful man who started the art gallery at St. Louis University and who helped restore an historic building there. A wonderful guy and really a passionate person about the topics of art and architecture and how they represented ideas, beliefs, and how they communicated in the language of symbols. And there are now 4 cathedrals or churches and cathedrals that influenced me or that really kind of got me going on this. The first one, St. Francis Xavier Church at St. Louis University, was right across the street from the classroom where Father McNamee taught. It's not a cathedral, but it replicates a cathedral. It replicates a cathedral in Cork, Ireland, called St. Colman's. St. Colman's sits high atop a promontory overlooking the harbor below. It is probably the last thing on land that folks who were crossing the Atlantic and the Titanic saw. As they looked back at Ireland, and Cork was their last port of call, probably the last thing that they would have seen was the very top of that spire in the distance as they were heading out to sea. It was the point of departure, Cork, that is, for many of the Irish immigrants coming to the United States at the time. But at any rate, St. Francis Xavier Church incorporates a lot of the symbolism and the design of St. Colman's Cathedral. And one of the things that Father McNamee pointed out was that some of the architectural elements represent Christian beliefs, like a trifoil or three-part window suggests the Trinity. There are other things in it that suggest other beliefs. So that idea that a building has meaning was really a big moment for me. Growing up in Milwaukee, I thought of nature having meaning, that it was God's creation and so forth. And the idea that buildings themselves could convey meaning too opened me up to a whole lot of possibilities and understanding, and really looking at the constructed world with new eyes, with kind of the veil lifted from my eyes. I began to see things in them or look for things that I really hadn't noticed before and really had taken for granted. So after that point, I really didn't take buildings for granted anymore. I grew up, in a city that didn't have the world's greatest architecture, but I looked around and I thought, well, some of the churches do. Well, it turned out that one of the churches in Milwaukee is patterned on Chartres Cathedral. It has mismatched towers. The architect was totally inspired by Chartres Cathedral, and Chartres Cathedral was one of the cathedrals that Father McNamee really focused on, particularly the stained glass there, which is unparalleled in its the collection, and the fact that it's so much has been saved from the Middle Ages. But the other cathedral during Father Mac's class that really caught my eye and inspired me, and this is what first took me to Europe, was Salisbury Cathedral. In the book we had this painting by John Constable of Salisbury Cathedral with water meadows in the foreground and people taking little strolls around. And the place just looked so peaceful, so bucolic, so utterly peaceful. I thought to myself, can this still be there? Can it still look that peaceful? Is it still that beautiful? The other thing that captured my imagination was that spire. It goes up over 400 feet. And I'm thinking to myself, how did somebody in the 1200s build something like that? How did they make it stand? Well, they did. And you can visit Salisbury Cathedral and do what's called a roof tour. Many of the British cathedrals have roof tours where you can go up into the attic and see actually how they built things. They didn't use nails, they used pegs and stuff like that to keep things together. And in this case, the tower had started to collapse. And in the 1600s, they devised a way to help buttress it and support it. And you can see all of that and how that's been done there. It's very interesting. So the other cathedral that really captured my imagination is the one below Washington National Cathedral in DC. I visited it first in the 1970s when it was still under construction. And when I moved to Washington, DC, Merce was living there already. I signed up as a volunteer greeter there and learned a lot about cathedrals and the history of cathedrals. So that explains, kind of how I got to this point in my interest in cathedrals from an academic standpoint. But there's something more to it. The thing that really pulled me in was trying to understand how the church at that time influenced my own religious beliefs, how the medieval church had or had not influenced my own understanding of Christianity. And at Chartres Cathedral, I found a touchstone for that. It's a place where I have found the medieval church that Martin Luther, and I grew up as a Lutheran, that the medieval church that Luther reacted to or reacted against, he and others. It's a church dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary. So it's a place where the cult of Mary thrived. Luther was very much opposed to that kind of thing. Many of the windows convey stories about saints, local saints and other saints. Cult of saints was also something that Luther reacted to, and so did I as a kid, just not understand. I didn't understand it. I didn't accept it, and I reacted to it too. So part of what I'm trying to do through my study of cathedrals is really come to an understanding of what we were reacting against, what I grew up reacting against, and trying to understand whether or not, in Lutheranism, we threw out some of the baby with the bathwater, whether there were things that we reacted to or that Lutherans reacted to that were things I would still react to as well. So at any rate, I've tried to be curious about the reaction that I grew up with in catechism class, in high school, and so forth. Knowing full well that I lived around many Catholics. I went to a Catholic church and Sunday school when my mom was working on Sunday mornings. Catholic people loved me and I loved them. And it was really now a time for me when I started off on this journey, really to understand where they were coming from and what it all means in the grand scheme of things.
And you married one.
And I married a Catholic. Mercedes is a Catholic. I went to a Catholic university just trying to get a different perspective on things. And a Catholic Jesuit priest turned me on to these 4 churches in the art and architecture class that I took. So at any rate, that's the gist of it. There's probably more in there somewhere, but it's probably time for us to move on to something else. And if you have any questions about it, by all means, email me sometime and I'll be happy to reflect and ruminate on this a little bit more. All right. I should ask, or answer the question, why Chartres Cathedral? Along with what I said, it's the cathedral that's intact. It's the one that has mainly survived from the 1100s and 1200s until now. The fact that it still has most of its original stained glass is amazing. Most of the cathedrals, its sister cathedrals, don't have that original glass anymore. It was lost in the wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation. It was lost in other wars, the wars of the 20th century. Chartres is the big survivor, and because it is, it's really a connection to that time period. They were trying to communicate a lot to us in the art and architecture that they built and passed along. So for those of you who weren't here earlier on in an earlier presentation, just to show you where Chartres is, it's about 48 miles southwest of Paris. Easy train ride, easy day trip from Paris. If you haven't been to Paris and you're thinking about going sometime, plan a day trip to Chartres. It's really well worth your while. So here, I've started the other presentations with a little bit of what I like about Chartres. So welcome back to Chartres. Last time we did this was, I think, in June. I was hoping to do one in July and then August, and things got in the way. So long and short of it is, welcome back. The scene there from the River Eure, a boathouse attached to a house. Just a beautiful walkway along that river connects Chartres with a little town downriver called Lève. Over to the right here is the breakfast room in the hotel where we stayed. It's the Hostellerie Saint-Yves, the hotellerie, or the Hostel Saint-Yves. Wonderful baguettes. If you go to Chartres, stay overnight, get breakfast here. This one, Chartres is known for other sacred structures aside from Notre Dame de Chartres. This one is the backside or the apse of St. Peter's Abbey, which is also well worth a visit, and it also has some great stained glass. Over to the right, there's a plaque. You aren't able to read it, so I'll tell you what's on it. It's a plaque along something called the Esplanade of the Resistance. Chartres was a center for resistance to the Nazis in World War II, and some of its history during World War II is honored on this Esplanade, which is like a block-long walk of different plaques and memorials. And this one is a memorial to George Patton's army that came through in 1944 and liberated Chartres. And in 3 languages, French on the top, English in the middle, and German on the bottom, it basically says, "Long live France, long live America, long live liberty," and then honors the 3rd Army and the 7th Armored Division that came through there and liberated Chartres. And one of our dear friends who was in that army, Gene Schultz, passed away just last month. He was instrumental in my visit there, my last visit in 2019 for the anniversary celebration of the liberation of Chartres. It was a wonderful event, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next presentation, number 4, which I'm terming Obscure Chartres. There are a lot of things that are out there about Chartres that most people don't know about, and some things that we're still discovering, like who saved Chartres Cathedral during World War II. Okay, moving on. Here's Chartres Cathedral from a distance. And let me just say this. Most of it was built between 1194, when it was hit by a fire, and about 1240, when its stained glass and other adornments were finally completed. It was completed in almost record time, about 50 years, and that was pretty quick for Gothic cathedrals. It is a Gothic cathedral in that it has some of the typical Gothic features, like pointed arches, big rose windows like you see there in the transept, and other Gothic features. It came after a period called Romanesque, but this is a good place to look at it from a Gothic point of view. So going back to this idea about transmission of knowledge, and it's kind of setting the context for the talks about, or some of this information about the 7 liberal arts at Chartres. The 7 liberal arts really were the subject of study during the ancient Greek and ancient Roman periods. And near the time that the Roman Empire was collapsing, coming up on the year between 450 and 500, between 400 and 500, there were several writers, Roman philosophers, who began to consolidate and synthesize a lot of the information that had been passed on to them, things that they learned from other philosophers. So they compiled a whole lot of information about the liberal arts, things that had been written by Plato, for instance, by Aristotle and others, that they then condensed and passed along. And the 4 of them, and I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail about each of these guys, but the big 4, a guy named Macrobius, who wrote a commentary on the Dream of Scipio, Marcianus Capella, who wrote something called On the Marriage of Philology and Mercury, which is basically on the marriage of wisdom and eloquence, 2 of the things that underscore the 7 liberal arts. A writer, probably the most important among them in terms of transmission of knowledge, called Boethius, who wrote on the consolation of philosophy while he was imprisoned awaiting execution at the hands of a Visigoth emperor the Visigoths had conquered Rome. Boethius was an old Roman and was trying to keep that Roman Empire and its thinking and beliefs and a lot of its customs and law alive, and ran afoul of the emperor and was executed for treason. But in the process, he was a Christian, and he wrote on the consolation of philosophy, talking about how the 7 liberal arts, or writing about how the 7 liberal arts were a solace to him, in pursuit of wisdom really to the very end, as a way of consoling himself in a really difficult time. And then the last one here, Isidore of Seville, who gave us the name of a town in California, San Isidro, wrote etymologies and De Natura, which is really about how things got their start. He pulled a whole lot of stuff together in a huge encyclopedia, which became sort of common and was also very popular and used by monks and others well into the Middle Ages. I just want to mention here that his encyclopedia, the etymologies, had 448 chapters in 20 volumes and talked about the liberal arts and a whole lot of other stuff. So long and short of it is a lot of theology in it. There were what they call glosses about different scriptural passages and things that he expanded on or elaborated on, tried to interpret, all included in there. So he was a reference guy, a main reference for people in the Middle Ages. So these four passed along their books, which became very, very popular in the 1100s, and were popular in the 1100s and 1200s, much copied. Again, before printing presses, these things were copied by hand by monks and scribes in scriptoria. And most of the libraries in Western Europe at the time had copies of these books. So they also showed up, these folks, in illuminated manuscripts and things that they had written. To the left here is Boethius, in a compilation of his books on music. Let me just think here. It's music, astronomy, and I think arithmetic. So at any rate, Boethius here is teaching, as teachers do, and there's this big globe hanging around, and Boethius wrote about music, one of the 7 liberal arts. And according to Wikipedia, one of my great sources here for all sorts of tidbits and wonderful anecdotal information, this globe represents the following words: a musical tone. That's one thing it represents. A diatessaron. That's a fourth above that musical tone. And then a diapente, a fifth above the musical tone. So this was in the part of his book, or in the part of his writings, his texts about music, de musica, or on the institutions, on the institutes of music. Wrote a lot about musical theory, and much of it was based on Pythagorean theory that he had brought into his writing. So anyhow, very influential in terms of music theory in the Middle Ages, as well as arithmetic and other topics. Over here on the right is a personification of Lady Geometry from a medieval manuscript written, basically passing on one of I'm trying to think here. I think it's Pythagoras. It's a book by Euclid, Euclidean geometry. Go figure. So at any rate, Marcianus Capella had compiled some things by Euclid, and this illumination shows Lady Geometry with calipers and other shapes, including this square, not a T-square, but a rectangular square, teaching monks. See, many of them have they have their monkish hairdos and so forth. So that figure of Lady Geometry was in Marcianus Capella's book, The Marriage of Philology and Mercury, Wisdom and Eloquence. Down below on the right, another illuminated manuscript shows Isidore of Seville. He became a bishop in Seville, so at any rate, next to a different monk. And illuminated manuscripts were really also an inspiration for the folks who designed the stained glass. So you might see some of their stuff that you might see parallels between them. So now I want to say a little bit about the intellectual climate at the time, and try not to dwell on this too much, but it also sets the stage for what we learn in a little bit about the 7 liberal arts. Coming into the Middle Ages, the dominant philosophy that kind of permeated Christianity was Platonism. And in a nutshell, a lot of the thinking that underscores, or is really the substance of Platonism, comes from one of Plato's dialogues called the Timaeus. And the Timaeus was one of the things translated from Greek and known to the people in the Middle Ages. They had excerpts of it, parts of it. And it kind of does this. And I'll read some of this. It was influential in this way. It begins with a distinction between the physical world and the eternal world. The physical one is the world which changes and perishes. Therefore, it is the object of opinion and unreasoned sensation. This is actually something that I think, no, this is, I'm not sure of the source for this, so stick with me. Sorry, I can get the source later. The physical one is the world which changes and perishes, therefore it is the object of opinion and unreasoned sensation. The eternal one never changes, therefore it is apprehended by reason. So Platonism made this distinction between the eternal or spiritual world and the physical world. And in time, that appeared to become really saying that the spiritual world is probably a little bit more important than the physical world. It's an idea that was adopted later on in Christianity. The other idea that came out of the Timaeus was the idea that the body is infused with soul. Timaeus kind of got the idea out there that the soul animates the human body and is really primary or more important to the body than the body itself. So it kind of went along with Christian thinking that came out of St. Paul to some extent, who emphasized the importance of spiritual pursuits over worldly pursuits, and was really picked up big time by St. Augustine of Hippo, who really believed that the spiritual took precedence over the material. And one historian pretty much summed up Augustine's views on those two things like this. This is from W.T. Jones, a book written in the 1960s called The Medieval Mind. He wrote, "Whatever information God intended us to have about the physical world, he wrote in plain language in the Bible. Whatever is not immediately obvious, God does not intend us to know." So that was sort of the outlook on things, that the spiritual was really much more important than the material. And as we got into what many historians call the Dark Ages, and it's really a misnomer. The Middle Ages in their entirety were not all dark. There were dark times early on after the fall of Rome, Viking invasions, political chaos, fragmentation of the landscape, loss of agricultural lands, the cities declined. That's all true. But by around the year 1000 or 1100, things were turning around. Still the Middle Ages, but not so dark anymore. And during the Middle Ages, one of the things that was done was copy books. The monasteries were copying books and passing them along to other monasteries and to cathedrals. And one monk said, "Of the making of books, there is no end." They could have kept at it all the time. And it's true. And those books were passed on. In the in the 1100s and 1200s, those books, along with books written by Aristotle. So here's a little bit of the Chartres. There was a school at Chartres Cathedral, and here's some things about it. Here's where we will see a little bit more about those 7 liberal arts. The cathedral school started in the Middle Ages. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, in the late 700s, required, and this is in part to reform the clergy, required schools in every monastery and bishopric in the diocese to establish schools that would teach the clergy basic grammar, how to read Latin, and so forth. They also brought in the children of the nobility, mainly the male children. So some of the kings of France and others were educated in these cathedral schools. The notable ones in France were at Chartres, Orléans, Paris, Lyon, Reims, and Rouen. You would see some scholars move among them, going from one to the other, where there were scholars who specialized in one of the liberal arts or another. Reims was well known around 1100 for its chancellor and the guy who was running it at the time, Gilbert, who was well known for his work in astronomy and mathematics. There were 5 main masters at Chartres Cathedral School between basically the year 1000 and the year 1200. They were written up in a book by really wonderful little book with anecdotes about these 5 men by Edward Jonot in a book entitled Rethinking the School of Chartres. I'm going to be talking about a few of them as we go on here, but we're not exactly sure when the School of Chartres got started, but it was pretty famous around the year 1000 because of Fulbert, who also was responsible for constructing the cathedral of that time with the west facade that we'll be looking at later. That part of the cathedral, of Fulbert's cathedral, was saved after the 1194 fire and incorporated into the building that's there now. Bernard of Chartres, a little bit more about him. He talked to me a little bit about an anecdote about Gilbert of Poitiers, and Thierry of Chartres, who got in trouble, and John of Salisbury, who wrote about them all. Mentioned that Aristotelian logic was a big thing between 1100 and 1200. It was a watershed moment in a lot of ways when the church people of the time, the scholars, began to read what was in Aristotle's work. And among the things that was in it were concerns or challenges to the idea of a personal God. There were challenges to the creation of the world. Aristotle believed that the world itself was eternal. There were challenges to the ideas that Plato had advanced about the soul. And that led to some controversy. And one of the first controversies involved Thierry of Chartres, who questioned the idea in Roman Catholicism of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He reasoned using logic that if bread is bread and wine is wine, and our perceptions of it, our examination of it, reveals that the bread is bread and that the wine is wine, well then it can't be the body of Christ and it can't be the blood of Christ. He was nearly excommunicated for advancing that idea, but recanted. And about 60 years after he died, a church council established the idea of transubstantiation as dogma for the Roman Catholic Church. That dogma became a major point of contention during the Reformation between Luther and the Roman Catholics. Luther thought of it as that the body and blood of Christ were represented in the host and in the wine, that they didn't actually become them, or that they became them in a mystical way. Other Protestants thought of the Eucharist as symbolic. So this was one of those points of departure, and one of the reasons why this time when Chartres Cathedral was being built is so pivotal, not only in my personal faith journey, but in the history of Christianity in our time. It's still one of those things being debated. Aristotle's teaching was censored at the University of Paris, which made a lot of other universities quite popular, and students made a major migration to some of them in the 1200s when some of Aristotle's works were being challenged and kept out of circulation. So here are some stained glass and other images about these folks. Full bear here in a stained glass window from the crypt, or the bottom level, the basement of Chartres Cathedral, a modern stained glass window teaching. Gilbert de Poiré from a manuscript, and John of Salisbury teaching. So they were popular not just in their schools, but also in things that were written about them. One of the things I want to just mention here about one of these folks at the School of Chartres, it's Bernard. He was called the foremost Platonist of our time, of their time. And he was known through the writing of John of Salisbury, who have made this quote that's also quite common in use these days. John of Salisbury wrote, Bernard of Chartres used to say that we are like dwarves perched on the shoulders of giants, and thus we are able to see more and farther than the latter. And this is not at all because of the acuteness of our sight or the stature of our body, but because we are carried aloft and elevated by the magnitude of the giants. That idea is illustrated in the south transept rose window at Chartres Cathedral. And over here on the right side, you see two gospel writers, Mark and John, who are on the shoulders of the Old Testament prophets, Zechariah and Daniel. They're literally seeing farther because they can sit on the shoulders of these ancient giants. Now, in the past, I've said, and I want to do it here again today, I look for connections between this and the things we see here in the United States. One of them is at the National Cathedral. The south transept rose window and the lancets under it there kind of convey the same idea. You have two gospel writers. They're not on the shoulders of, but they're standing on the foundation of, below them, two of the Old Testament prophets. So this idea from Chartres is replicated here, and we hear it now in scientists talking about how they can see farther because they're building on the shoulders of giants who came before them. It's a very common phrase and a wonderful image that I'm happy has endured these 800 years. So here's a little bit about the curriculum at the cathedral schools, just 7 liberal arts. Religion, they called it the Divina Pagina, the divine page in Latin. I might add that the term theology was actually dubbed by Abelard, Peter Abelard, in the 1200s. That's when they started to talk about theology and religion as sort of a science of religion. And then these other topics were the things that they studied at the cathedral schools. Not all of them at the same school, but this is what you might find at different schools.
We do have 2 questions relating to the schools.
Okay. Go for it.
One, David Seligman is asking if the schools preceded the building of Chartres Cathedral?
We're not, the cathedral schools did. They grew out of Charlemagne's proclamation around 750. Some cathedrals jumped on it right away. Others took a little longer. We're not exactly sure when the cathedral school at Chartres started, but it was more than likely there in the 900s. And we're not sure who started it, but it really became popular around the year 1000 with Fulbert of Chartres. So they predate they predate the Gothic cathedrals. There was a cathedral school at Notre Dame of Paris in its old form. So they were there longer than the Gothic cathedrals, to be sure. And the other one, Cora?
Second question comes from Stephen Abramo,
Yes.
who asks, what led to the school's closing?
The schools continued, some of the schools continued well through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And one of the things that contributed to their decline was the rise of universities. The University of Paris was chartered in the 1200s. Oxford University and Cambridge in England were chartered around that same time. Before the University of Paris, there was the University of Bologna in Italy, well known for, I think, law and medicine. So there were the universities taking off, and that's where a lot of the major scholars went to teach, and the students followed them. Others, Cora? Anything else?
That is it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to look at the west facade, royal portal, right bay. 7 liberal arts. They're represented in the little archivolts around Mary and Jesus, who were seated in a configuration that's called Mary, the seat of wisdom. Jesus being wisdom, and Jesus being associated with wisdom from the very beginning of Christianity. Wisdom kind of equating with knowledge, learning, and acquiring information. There were 7 liberal arts, 3 that are known as the language arts. They are grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And then 4 arts of things, the things that are out there: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. We're going to look at how they were represented in the sculpture here, and how to, when you go to Chartres or any other cathedral where you'll find these things, you know what to look for. Grammar was the main thing that people studied in these schools. It took up most of the curriculum. The others, arithmetic, geometry, were sort of advanced topics. So let's focus first on grammar. This was all about Latin grammar. And over here on the left, you see a female personification of grammar. This comes from those books, the allegorical books that were written around 500 that transmitted this information about the ancient Greek and Roman teaching on this topic. So Lady Grammar is presented with 2 students, one of them falling asleep, the other one trying to listen, and she's teaching with a book. She's also holding here something called a ferule, which is a reed sort of conglomeration that was used to whack some of the students when they were falling asleep. The anecdote about Gilbert of Poiré is this, one of those masters of Chartres. He was known as a demanding master, and he was demanding in this one respect. John of Salisbury wrote an anecdote about how one of the students, or a couple of the students, in speaking to him, addressing him, instead of saying Master Theodore in Latin, they were supposed to reverse it and say Theodore Master. So, or I'm sorry, Gilbert. You're supposed to say Master Gilbert. They were supposed to say in Latin, reversing the adjective Gilbert Master instead of Master Gilbert, but they kind of did it differently. And he called them on it and had one of the guys whipped as a way to express his dissatisfaction with his lack of attention. Many of the Chartres masters were very good about balancing punishment with encouragement. They theorized about it and actually wrote some wonderful things about the importance of teachers teaching with interesting style and not getting into the minutia, about students paying attention and being there seriously, all of that kind of thing. But some of them were a little bit harsh in their approach to teaching this stuff. And over here on the right is one of the ancients who wrote about grammar, about Latin verbs and Greek verbs and all sorts of other things, Donatus. He went back even further than those guys, Macrobius and Bathius that I spoke of earlier. He's one that they incorporated. Dialectic, another term for logic or reasoning. This one has Lady Dialectic with a dragon. She's usually depicted with a snake and also with a flower, so that the flowering of knowledge, but also the bite of a snake flying combines the ideas of earth and heaven, but that there's something about logic that is divine and human incorporated in this dragon figure here. Aristotle is here on the right, pretty much known by that time as the father of logic, father of learning. He was highly regarded by the mid 1100s. And over here on the right is an important little sculpture that tells us about Aristotle's view of the cosmos. He and others before him thought of the cosmos world, and what we see around us, as made up of four classical elements: air, earth, fire, and water. Air is represented here by birds in the trees, water down below by a fish, earth by the trees, and underneath the fish, you can't see them, are little flames that were originally there. So those four elements constituted what they thought of at the time as the elements of the world. Aristotle added a fifth one called ether to describe the substance of the heavens, from which we get the word ethereal. And because it's the fifth essence, we also get the word quintessence from it. So Aristotle had a big impact on our language for how he thought of the cosmos at the time. Here's rhetoric with eloquence. This is Lady Eloquence lifting up her robe to make a point in some court, as a lawyer might have made in a court at that time. And next to her is Cicero, the great Roman rhetorician and lawyer, who unfortunately lost his head when Mark Antony didn't quite like the way Cicero's thinking about continuing the Roman Republic was going. Lady Arithmetic on this side with a book. Over on the right is Bathius. He wrote a book entitled On Arithmetic. So a lot of basic arithmetic stuff came from Bathius's writings. Lady Geometry, she's actually holding, at one point was holding a compass in her hands next to Euclid, father of Euclidean geometry, and dating to the 300s BCE. Astronomy, Lady Astronomy with an astrolabe in her hand. The astrolabe was used in the Middle Ages to measure the stars, tell time, a whole lot of other things that helped them figure out when the seasons were, when there would be can't think of the word right now, but phenomenon in the sky. There you go. At any rate, and she's next to Ptolemy, who wasn't Ptolemy, one of the Egyptian pharaohs, but Ptolemy, the astronomer, who wrote an important book called the Almagest.
We've got 3 questions. I don't know if you want to keep going on some symbolism stuff here.
Now let me just finish up on the liberal arts,
Okay.
the liberal arts. Here's Lady Music ringing bells, playing what's called a psalterion here, down here, and over here a stringed instrument called a viol. And to her right is Pythagoras, who came up with various theories about proportions in music. So at any rate, let's now take those questions, Cora.
All right. Kathy Levy is asking if the average visitor to Chartres in the Middle Ages would know the meaning of all of these symbols that were around them.
Couple things to mention. Most folks were illiterate at the time. The nobility and aristocracy, many of them, men, were educated in cathedral schools. Women were sometimes educated at home, women in the nobility. Clergy would have probably known this pretty well. Common folk, not so much. And it's unclear whether or not the clergy would take them on tours and explain this kind of stuff to them. But it's thought now that the stained glass windows in cathedrals like Chartres were really sort of a library for common folk, because they would recognize many of the things they would hear about in the liturgy, Bible readings and so forth, and recognize them in the stained glass. Things like Christ's crucifixion that was there. There are some people who think that the clergy used them as teaching aids, that they might have pointed out things to them when they were giving sermons and so forth. But Kathy, I don't know for sure how much the common folk could read cathedrals the way we're reading them now. Cora, next one.
Yes. Dominique is asking about the female representation of grammatica and dialectic. And I guess really all of the other, all of those other ones as well, eloquence, arithmetic, geometry, etc. If those date to the Middle Ages, or were those representations, or is it also the case in Greek and Roman representations? Excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic, for that question. They actually date back to Macrobius and Bathius. They used these female allegorical figures as the as stand-ins, as representations of these 7 liberal arts in the books that they wrote. So a lot of the writing that they did was allegorical and teaching at the same time, but a lot of these images date back to the 500s and were then incorporated into the sculpture here at Chartres and other cathedrals too. Lady Astrolabe appears at Sens Cathedral, which dates a little bit before Chartres too.
We have one more question from Maureen Kerrigan asking 2 questions. What happened to the compass? Might have missed which figure the compass was on, but
I got it.
So what happened?
Geometry.
Okay. So what happened to the compass, and who was Lady Arithmetic?
Compass was probably here in her right hand. It's not clear whether or not this was broken off at the time by Vandal or during the French Revolution. There was some damage done at Chartres Cathedral during the French Revolution. There was even talk about tearing it down, the whole thing down. Local proponents prevailed. So I don't know exactly what happened to her hand. I can say that there are a lot of heads and hands and other such things from this and other cathedrals in a wonderful museum in Paris called the Cluny Museum of Paris, which pulled together a lot of the things that were ruined in the French Revolution into one place. And Lady Arithmetic, I am not sure what she's doing, Maureen. She might be counting something. She kind of looks like she is, and she's got a book there. A lot of the learning that was done, the arithmetic learning that was done, was through books, not through a whole lot of novel or speculative calculation. A lot of it was rote. And that brings me to another thing I should have mentioned before. The term liberal arts. What does it mean, liberal? There are two theories or two explanations for it. One is that it refers to the topics, the subjects that free men in Rome learned in their schooling. The other, proposed by a monk in the 500s, was that it refers to the books, that the people in the Middle Ages read books, they learned from books. Books were incredibly important to them and their education. So liber in Latin means both free and book. So it's, most folks think that it means liberal for the education of free men and women. But this is just another one of those images with a book where, you know, it conjures up all sorts of associations. And you see also here something else that I forgot to mention. These are the little lap desks that were used in the Middle Ages. They show them, you know, with the philosophers from ancient Rome and Greece using them, but really they're medieval lap desks. Okay.
Music we didn't talk about.
Merce just mentioned that we didn't talk about music, and you're right. I'll finish up with this. I want to talk a little bit about the instruments here. And I have to be careful because I'm reading from some notes and I need to make sure I'm not making too much noise with them. This instrument is called the psalterion, and it's from that Greek word that we come up with the word psalter, Psalter, which is also another word used for the book of Psalms, but for the book of Psalms when put to music. So psalter came from psalterion, this particular instrument. Behind her is a stringed instrument. I looked closer at another image I have, and it has 3 strings. I believe it's an instrument called a vielle, V-I-E-L-L-E. It became a precursor, was a predecessor for the viol, which came later, the V-I-O-L, in the 1400s in Spain, and the violin, which came even later. But it's important to note that by the Middle Ages, they were using musical accompaniment to the liturgical music. Earlier in the Middle Ages, I mean, you probably all know about Gregorian chant. It's all plain song. There's not a lot of instrumentation going on behind the scenes. But by the Middle Ages, there was, and this was one way to represent that transition from early to high Middle Ages. Okay, Greek philosophers in America. Just to make this connection, at Riverside Church in New York City, Socrates and Aristotle appear. Socrates was Plato's teacher. So from him, you get Platonism. From Aristotle, you get Aristotelianism. And you have St. Paul and Jesus above them in one of the panels there. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes about this. The 4 classical elements show up in some churches in the United States and elsewhere in modern times. At Church of St. Thomas on 5th Avenue in New York, there are these wonderful sculptures of the 4 classical elements. This one on the upper left, water. It has a porpoise, and porpoise is dancing in the sea. You can see them there. Catty corner from it, there's a scorpion in a fire. Okay, representing that other element, fire. Up on the right, this is from Princeton University Chapel. It's the ancient symbol for the earth. Basically, it just has mountain symbols on it, jagged lines. That's above a Greek philosopher named Aristarchus, who was the first to come up with the idea that the sun was at the center of the solar system. And he did that about 250 years before Christ, before the Common Era. In Cologne, Germany, in a modern window replacing medieval glass, there's an image of Air, Lady Air, holding birds to represent things that fly in the air. So that's where we see them. We still see these same classical elements in structures around us. Okay, I'm realizing we're well past 8. I underestimated again how long this all would take me. I can shift the whole thing about interpreting the Bible to next time and talk about that along with obscure chart. Cora, any other questions that came in as we talked about this?
No other questions, but Madeline did note also that the Latin words for the liberal arts were all feminine. Eka, etc.
Good, thank you. Very good. Good catch. Good comment.
If you want to continue, people can leave if they must.
Well, the question here, folks, I can continue for another 20 minutes, say till 8:30 and finish up this stuff on interpretation. If you're willing to stay, I'll do that. If you have to go, by all means, don't feel like you have to stay. So I think I can finish this up in 20 minutes. Merce, thanks for the suggestion. Okay, interpreting the Bible. Here you see some familiar names already. One that I haven't spoken of was a Christian theologian named Origen. He lived in Alexandria in what is now Egypt, at a time when it was part of the Roman Empire, and also at a time when Alexandria was a real melting pot for different cultures and different religious beliefs. Origen worked side by side with Jewish theologians and others from Egyptian and other mystery religions at the time, but he worked closely with Jewish theologians and learned a lot about biblical interpretation from them. St. Augustine from Hippo kind of passed some of that along, and then St. Isidore of Seville, who we've already talked about. These two gave us 4 senses of Scripture, and the interpretive approach was that some things were meant to be read literally, some things were meant to be read analogically or as analogs. Others were meant to be read as morals, turning the meaning on oneself, looking inside oneself at what it tells you. And the other was anagogical, referring to the afterlife and things that it might have to say or allude to about the afterlife, even if it didn't explicitly come out and say that. This is a mystical sort of approach to scriptural interpretation. It's this analogical one where we get into the whole thing about allegory and analogs and looking at comparisons between Old and New, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, New Testament, the Christian Testament. We're going to be looking at the Noah window, which is almost, it's just inside the main entrance to Chartres Cathedral on the left, on the north side. And this is what it looks like from below. It has many scenes. We read them from left to right and bottom to top. And we're going to take a look at some of these scenes and just enjoy the window a little bit. Toward the bottom are what are called the Nephilim. And it's not clear whether these were meant to be giants or fallen angels. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4 says that the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. So they're legendary in some way, and we really don't know exactly who they were or why they're in the book of Genesis. And God said unto Noah, build an ark So a little later in Genesis 6, God looked upon the earth. Behold, God saw that it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So violence was part of the corruption. He tells Noah to make an ark of gopher wood, rooms that they'll make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without with pitch. So you have here God talking to Noah, God in the person of Christ. Remember, Christians at the time were thinking that Christ, as part of the Trinity, was an image for God. Over here on the right, Noah and one of his sons building the ark, kind of multicolored. And down here, people talking about what the heck is going on in Noah's yard. Later in Genesis, and of every living thing of all flesh, bring two, male and female. Clean beasts take by sevens, unclean beast 2. Clean animals, quadrupeds that chew the cud and also divide the hoof. Others like the sheep, gazelle, roebuck, pig, antelope, or the unclean. So here you have animals coming to the ark. Camel, birds, lion, and others. Here you have the deluge from chapter 7, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth. Humans here, bird of prey, carrion, picking on carrion, another grisly, gruesome image. It's there at Chartres. And the ark, floating on the waters. Genesis 8, he sent forth a dove from him, Noah that is, to see if the waters were abated from the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Here you see the ark not looking necessarily like an ark, but like a church, a Romanesque church with Roman arches, with green, the color of the cross, red, the color of sacrifice on the cross. We'll come back to this in just a little bit because it's really important to the interpretation of this window. Here you see the animals leaving the ark. And Noah builded an altar after they left the ark, and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Above the rainbow and the covenant. Chapter 9, God says, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant, which is between you and all living creatures. So now the ark and flood as symbols. Here's where I'll talk a little bit about the interpretation at that time, how they looked at it, and some things from some modern scholars who have chimed in on this. You see the Romanesque church here in the colors of that we saw earlier in an earlier presentation that also were on the cross. Green for the tree of life, red for as a color of sacrifice, symbolizing Christ's sacrifice. Malcolm Miller, who is a long time docent at Chartres Cathedral, wrote this. According to early medieval writers, including Isidore of Seville, Noah is portrayed as a savior figure, savior prefiguring Christ, and the ark as the means of saving is a symbol for the church. Thus, the flood symbolizes both baptism, Christian sacrament, cleansing through water, and the last judgment. There are other analogies. Baptism is one of the church's sacraments, washes away sin, as the flood washed away sinful humankind. So associations and connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament in Christian thinking, and that there's a concordance, a unity, a reflection between one and the other. And it goes on, the church provides the means of grace. This is also taken from Isidore of Seville, provides the means of grace through which believers avoid punishment at the last judgment. The Pope, at the time that the cathedral was being built, Pope Innocent III, wrote this in a letter to the King of Bulgaria in 1204, and it just really sums up how they thought about these things. Indeed, Innocent III wrote, the church is that ark in which a few souls were saved, the others perishing in the flood. Just as all those not taken in the ark perished in the flood, so will those found outside the church be damned. And he goes on that Peter, with whom he identified as the Pope, came to the Lord across the waves of the sea, which signifies the world. So he saw a connection between the ark and the papacy, at Peter as the shepherd who first shepherded the church after Christ, was also a Noah figure who brought the saved together. So a lot of different ways that they looked at it, and they summed a lot of this stuff up in the sermons of the day, some of which have been recorded. So where do you see some of this stuff in the United States? 4 blocks from our house in Iowa City, on the left, is the flood window at Our Redeemer Lutheran Church. It shows the ark, the rainbow, the scallop shell as a symbol of baptism, the whirling winds looking like 3 whirling winds, a symbol for the Trinity, and the idea conveyed here that the church is a place where people seek safety in stormy seas. The other one, on the right, is from the Noah window in Kansas City. It's Central United Methodist in Kansas City. It's not in the Bible, but it's a nice little image where an angel is sharing the blueprints for the ark with Noah, and he's looking at them very, very carefully. So that's a little bit about how they approached these things. They looked in stories in the Hebrew Bible for analogies to their Christian beliefs. And there was a lot of what they saw as one thing prefiguring the next, one thing in the Hebrew Bible suggesting something in the New Testament, and long and short of it, they look for something called concordance, which is really a unity between the two testaments, between Old and New. So with that, I'll wrap it up and say thank you again for joining. Are there other questions, Cora, that came in? We still have a few minutes.
No other questions. Paul S., I think Paul Schultz, so the Bible reference to the ark and flood and baptism is 1 Peter.
Okay.
Verses 3:20 to 21.
Thank you, Paul. Paul's Lutheran. Go ahead.
Yeah, 1 Peter 3:20 and 21. And do you want me to read that to you?
Sure.
These spirits disobeyed long ago when God's patience was waiting in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In this ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. And corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the guarantee of a good conscience before God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So there he's talking about how the flood and the ark are kind of referencing and baptism saving us.
Good. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. So you have it there in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament in a letter from Peter. So yeah, thank you. Good connection. Appreciate it. Anyhow, one more slide, huh? There we go. Merce reminded me I need to move on here to promote the next one coming up in a couple weeks, Obscure Chart, where you'll hear about an aspiring ass, that is donkey, about gargoyles, grotesques, and other oddities. Might have, I don't know if I spelled that right. I guess I did. And then